You're listening to the It's Only Rock and Roll podcast with your host, Don 𝗵𝗃𝗹𝗶.
Well, all right. Welcome to the... I can't talk like that. Well, all right. Welcome back to yet another episode of the It's Only Rock and Roll podcast, episode 44 to be exact. I am your host, Don 𝗵𝗃𝗹𝗶, and we have yet another great show. But first, before we get into it, I do want to give a shout out to a good friend of the show, David 𝗀𝗃𝗃, aka 𝗵𝘃𝗶𝗵𝗁. He's got a great YouTube channel, appropriately called 𝗵𝘃𝗶𝗵's Beatles Channel, where he discusses various pressings of Beatles and related releases while showing off his unique personal collection of rare LPs and memorabilia. Basically, it's record porn for Fab Four fans like me, and I highly recommend you check him out on YouTube. A link to his channel is in the show notes. Every year, people pay insane amounts of money to attend the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp, just for a chance to perform alongside some of the biggest legends of rock, and to only briefly experience what today's guest has been doing his entire adult life, as one of the most accomplished sideman guitarists on the scene for almost 50 years now. Except he did it the old-fashioned way, by earning a stellar reputation, working in studio and on stage with David Bowie, Ian Hunter, 𝗷𝗂𝗶𝗫𝗫, 𝗲𝗂𝗹𝗃, and perhaps most notably with John Lennon and Yoko Ono on what would be Lennon's last recording sessions for Double Fantasy and the posthumous release Milk and Honey. He's also had an accomplished solo career, including last year's release, 𝗊𝗑𝗆 of Devils. And if I don't shut up and introduce him already, he's going to come over here and kick my ass. So, please welcome to the It's Only Rock and Roll podcast, Earl Slick.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for doing this.
Hey, my pleasure, man.
You're fresh off a rather special appearance in Liverpool, commemorating Beatle Week, which reunited yourself with Tony Levin and Andy Newmark.
You know, we were supposed to do every year the Cavern Club in Liverpool. You know, they do a whole week. It's Beatle Week up there. And they have performances and speakers and people like myself that were involved somehow with the Beatle. And it's a whole week of, the entire city of Liverpool turns into Beatlemania for like 7 days. And part of this year was that they wanted to perform the 40th anniversary of the release of Double Fantasy, which was 2 years ago. But because of the pandemic, it got pushed last year and it got pushed again. So we finally did it. We did the show at the Liverpool Philharmonic on the 26th, like a week and a half ago.
Yeah. Full attendance, obviously.
Oh, yeah. It was full. You know, the attendance was great. The coolest thing is that to pull something like this off, where you've got only 3 original band members, and then you've got to find the right fit for the rest of the band, and they really did. So, for me to play these songs again with Tony Levin and Andy Newmark it was great. It really was. And then the guys that we had in the band, they were great. They had it down. So me and Tony and Andy, we didn't have to really do much thinking.
Now, the guy who did John, Mark McGann, was he the one who did the TV special years and years ago, John and Yoko, Love Story? That's him, right?
That's him, yeah. And he sang great. And you know what was good about it? Sometimes in these kind of shows, when you've got a deceased famous dude, a lot of times the singers try too much to emulate the guy. And It usually backfires. And one thing about Mark was he just sang the songs, and he sang them great. And he wasn't trying to dress like Lennon or any, you know what I mean? He got up there as himself and kicked some good butt. He really did a great job.
Was it filmed or anything? So I would love to see it.
It was filmed. I don't know what they're going to do with it. I'm still looking for the various fan cell phone clips, and there are not many around.
Stupid question, maybe, but did you do the Yoko songs too?
Yeah.
And who sang for her?
Oh, I can't remember her last name. Argentinian girl, 𝗃𝗃𝗃. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot her last name. I just met her on this thing.
Yeah.
And she did a great job. Really good job on it.
Now, you were born and raised in the capital of the world, Brooklyn, New York. Yep. Probably during the greatest period to be alive, at least from a music standpoint. What was some of your earliest memories of first hearing rock and roll?
God, the first memories I have of hearing rock and roll probably was around my house when I was a little kid, just on the radio.
Yeah.
My mother was, I would guess you could call her kind of progressive because, we're talking about the 1950s, late 50s, early 60s. She would listen to the rock and roll stations and mostly actually the country stations.
Yeah.
So I heard plenty of it as a kid.
And there was a lot of crossover back then. You would have heard Elvis, obviously, on a country station.
Yeah. So, we heard all of that stuff. And as everybody in my age group, my generation, almost every player that you'll talk to will tell you the same thing. The night that the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show was what got the fire going, with all of us. Something about what we saw and heard on that show really did prompt us. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to be in a band. And that was my first introduction to wanting to do it. But I'd heard it before that. I'd been listening to it.
Had you been playing? Or was that came after?
That was later because it wasn't until I saw those guys that all of a sudden they had to have a guitar. And it took about 4 or 5 months of just torturing my father until he broke down and got me a Dan Electro convertible acoustic, they called it. I think he paid like $30 for it.
Yeah.
And he gave it to me and he said, well, you're either going to get good enough or not, but it's the last one I'm buying for you. That's the way my dad gave gifts.
Yeah. And what was some of the guitar heroes, quote unquote, that you were listening to early on and trying to emulate to get your own style?
Early on, I was just absorbing all these different bands we'd never seen before. And if you look at it, 1964, most of what you would have been exposed to on TV and even radio was all coming from Great Britain. All of it was. I mean, sure, they were American artists, but the Beatles, the Stones, the Zombies, the Who, you name it.
Yeah.
They basically hijacked the top 100.
Sure.
For quite a while. So I got to hear all those guitar players in their early stages. So early on, I mean, the first guitar players that really got my attention was Keith Richards and Brian Jones. And then Jeff Beck when he was in the Yardbirds, and Clapton back then. So it was all in that bluesy R&B area that I really liked. I loved Cropper. I didn't even know that I had been listening to Steve Cropper and loving him for years because back then he was kind of invisible,
right.
He wasn't like a household name like he became. And years later, I realized, oh my God, all those licks I've been stealing from Sam and Dave and Otis and all that's all Cropper stuff.
Right. All that Booker T and the MGs backing.
Absolutely. Well, Green Onions is one of the first songs we learned because back then everybody wanted to be in a band, but everybody was terrified to be the singer. So we did a lot of instrumentals at the beginning.
Oh, sure. You mentioned Brian Jones. Vastly underrated as a guitar player. Probably getting overshadowed by Keith, but so influential.
I think that time did not do service to Brian Jones. His reputation. Back then, the kind of stuff that he was doing all the time, not showing up for stuff or showing up completely baked when he got to the studio, and which years later became normal. And I think that did tinge his reputation, which it wouldn't do now. Matter of fact, the stupider shit you do now, the better off you are,
Except he's too talented for today. You can't. You got to be stupid and not have talent. That's how you get famous today.
Don't get me going.
Exactly. I was
Do
going to say that.
not get me going because I'll start naming names and we don't want to get into that.
Kardashian?
So,
no.
how did you know? You just picked it right. You picked it right out of my head. It's like, and God bless anybody who is good enough at becoming that famous and that rich. That in itself is a major talent that most musicians don't have. We can have lifelong careers, but most of us don't have a Kardashian billion-dollar business,
Right. And a business famous for doing nothing, just for being famous.
Well, there's an art to that, though. You see, you can't. I don't discount that. There's an art to that. That's got to be difficult to do when you didn't invent something, you didn't create something, but you managed to be famous. You created yourself into this thing,
right? An image. Yeah, and that's the thing. Now we're really getting off topic, but in a way, it is important to think. Could a Beatles, could a Stones, a band today with as much talent as they had, even get noticed? Or is it just too much noise now?
That's a good question. And I've had a philosophy on that for quite a while. Life changes. Entertainment business reflects life, whether it be movies, television, music, whatever. And as things change in the world and the country, so does all the art forms. They do. They go with the times. And at the time that rock and roll was created in the 50s, and then it took another step into the future with the British invasion, it was timely. It meant something back then. There was a reason that I can get it. I have a philosophy about this. If you give me a minute, I'll try not to. In the 1950s, the country was not far off from where it is now, in a way, where we were so divided. It was the old generation against the new generation. It was the McCarthy era fear-mongering politicians. There was hiding under your desk during an air raid shelter, because we used to have H-bomb drills in school, and the bell would go off and you go into your desk like that was going to do a lot of good. But that's the world we lived in. And the music that Elvis and Chuck Berry and all these guys, Bill Haley, 𝗷𝗄𝗧𝗘 Valens, if you take all of that music, it was definitely so geared to a much younger generation of people who didn't understand or very much like the world that they lived in. So there was their escape.
Yep.
And then you get the Beatles come along, and that was like stage 2 of it, because the same thing that was happening here was happening over in England, but it took a little bit more time because they absorbed everything from here, brought it back to the UK, and created their own version of it. And that got us through X amount of years. And then that changed. Then the format changed from a 78 clay disc to a vinyl disc to a 8-track, CDs, on and on. And as that changed, so did the art form. So I don't look at it today that no matter how good you are, let's say, as the rock and roll that we knew, try to put yourself in the shoes of a 16 to 25-year-old.
Yeah.
And sit them down in front of a TV and put on I Love Lucy and see what happens. Because that show was, people would gear their week to sit down with the family with popcorn and watch that every single week religiously like that. They those two were like rock stars in that show, Lucy and Desi. And it meant something, but to somebody born each generation are looking at the older stuff that doesn't actually really apply to their world that much. So I don't see it. I think that rock and roll, number one, has had one hell of a long run, because all of the bands that were successful, the big ones, are still touring. And a matter of fact, it's all the older bands that are filling up more seats and making all the money.
Yes.
The newer bands, as the internet, actually, once MTV came on the scene and oversaturated everything, then the internet came, and that changed everything. Because before, a real fan, and I used to do this, I heard an announcement that there was a new Stones single coming out, and I would go to the little mom and pop record store every day and hound the guy. When are you getting these? Mm-hmm. When are you getting these? Mm-hmm. Whereas now, you hear, oh, so-and-so's got a record, and if you happen to like the band, you'll Google them, you'll find them, you'll download maybe 1 or 2 songs, but you're not going to buy an album like, a real diehard fan would do. And all of these things added up bring me back to the point that rock and roll has done its job, and it's still viable art form, no doubt. But when you're putting yourself in the shoes of a much younger person from today, it just doesn't equate.
I'm going to push back a little bit on what you're saying. I was born in 71. So what is that? Like me and you are like 20 years apart.
Right.
I listened to the same music that you listen to. I got into the Beatles when I was 8 in 79.
Right.
Hardcore. I watched I Love Lucy. I got into all that stuff. How come it's so far removed today and these kids don't pick it up? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just I'm like the angry old man at the bar saying, when I was a kid.
Okay, all disrespect not intended.
Right.
That's exactly what you're talking like, that old man. Because what about Billie Eilish, man? She's got her audience in the palm of her hand. They love that girl. She's everything to them that David Bowie and the Beatles were to us. Okay. She means as much to them. It's their world. It's their generation. She's 20 years old. She got the balls to go out there. And as far as styling goes in her image, it's
It's different too. I give her that.
Well, so with the Beatles, I
Right.
mean, with our age difference, I think you understand to a point how different the Beatles were. But if you had actually seen the reaction of our parents and to all the old people, and I'm talking back then, 30.
Oh, I know. That was old.
It was old, right?
That was, yeah.
They looked at the Beatles. They were freaking out.
Of course.
They were totally freaking out, and not in a good way. And then the Stones came along, which was my cup of tea for real. All of a sudden, the Beatles started to become acceptable because the Stones were such bad boys, you know? Yeah. But, the other reason, too, that you were still hearing those records, by the time you were 8 or 9 years old, if you were listening to the stuff, it was still being played very much on the radio.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the guys that were in the Beatles were in other bands. The Stones were still active. It was still happening.
I remember hearing 𝗀̀cie 𝗴𝗆𝗃 saying next week, the new John Lennon single coming out. Emotional Rescue was big back then for the Stones. Yeah, no, exactly.
But also back then, you had key people. Murray the K, for instance, who was a big promoter of he loved bringing over British bands. 𝗀̀cie 𝗴𝗆𝗃 was another one. There was a DJ in New York named Cousin Brucey.
I love Cousin Brucey, yeah.
Had the wackiest voice.
Yeah.
And I forgot oh God, all Beatles all day was their slogan or something. So, but there were only a few of them. Now, if you go on the internet, there's like 60 million bloggers.
Right.
As opposed to 3 or 4 guys in each city that were special guys. I remember there was a guy in Cleveland. I used to love this guy. His name was 𝗀𝗏𝗃𝗃. And he was always at the cutting edge with the new bands. But these were individual people that actually, you could see them.
I'm in Rhode Island. We had a guy, Chuck Stevens.
Right. I know who you're talking about.
Great guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had a good radio station. That's the other thing, radio.
Right. There was radio. And now it's too easy to open up your laptop and get pretty much anything you want 24 hours a day. If you run out of shampoo at 7 o'clock in the evening and you go on Amazon, you might have a bottle at your house by noon the next day. You know what I mean? That's ridiculous. So you can get anything you want, anytime you want. And when music and art become that accessible, especially when you can listen to and watch a lot of it for nothing, it takes the monetary value. I don't think it takes away the artistic value as much, but it definitely takes away the monetary value.
I know you have a new album out, for example. Now, you get played on Spotify. What are you making? 0.00%?
That's about right.
Right? Because to make money, you got to tour.
Well, a lot of the newer bands out there, and I think it's mostly the metal bands, they'll have these caravans where they have 6 acts that go out and they tour everywhere. But these poor guys, they're living out of their van. They're selling their merch out of their van. They're working their asses off. But whatever they're generating is probably just enough money to keep them going on the road because it's what they love to do.
Right.
But in this day and age, to actually have a band that sells that many records where it means the same thing as it meant before, it's another world.
Exactly right. I want to get back to you a little bit. I feel bad. I'm sorry. I could talk about it all day.
Well, that's actually an important thing to talk about because I hear this stuff like everything sucks. Nobody can do this. Nobody can write songs. Well, it's the way you're viewing it from your memories of what really inspired you to listen to music, So that's why I think it's important.
Now, you can answer this any way you want. How did Frank Mataloni become Earl Slick?
Which way, name-wise or person-wise?
Like I said, any way you want.
It's funny. The name came, we used to do clubs. It's just another thing, too. We could make money without leaving New York City. There were clubs in Brooklyn, Staten Island, Queens, Manhattan, everywhere. And we played cover band stuff 5 nights a week for years. And during that time, I had a band named Bojack, and the lead singer, Jack O'Neill. You're doing 5 sets a night, 5 nights a week of cover stuff. You get bored. So every night he would introduce us, the band, and we'd all have different names that he'd made up. One of them was the Earl Slick thing, and I ended up liking it. So I kept it.
I saw an interview where you were talking about a certain accent in Brooklyn.
Oh, yeah, the Oil and Earl thing.
I love that, yeah.
Yeah, which you don't hear anymore. But
that's like an Archie Bunker thing.
Yeah, exactly. As that generation pronounced like, you'd burl an egg or burl water. So from growing up with that, sometimes I'd slip into that, which he was from down south, and he just thought it was funny. So, Earl Slick, and eventually here I am.
Yeah, you are. It's something I didn't know until very recently, that Michael Kamen played a significant role in getting you to your next level.
Oh, yeah, he did. I met Michael through a friend of mine, 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, Hank went on to be a very successful songwriter, actually, and photographer in Nashville. He's written a lot of hits. I met Michael, and Michael would help me out and get me like a little studio gig once in a while. If I wanted to record some songs, he'd get me in the studio. He became my mentor. And long story short, he'd run into David Bowie at the Joffrey Ballet in New York, and David wanted to meet the guy who did the score, which was Michael. And Michael was there, and they had a chat. This was right after Mick Ronson had left the band, saying he was looking for a guitarist, and Michael threw my name in the hat.
What did you have to do? Was it a matter of auditioning, or was it just word of mouth?
It was it was an audition. I thought I'd show up with there'd be a band in a rehearsal place, and David and I'd play and blah blah. That wasn't the way it went down. I met those guys at RCA recording studios while they were mixing the Diamond Dogs record. So when I walked in the studio that night, the control room was pretty dark, and they just put me right in the studio, and there was an amp in there that I plugged in, and then a voice came over the intercom telling me to put my headphones on. So I did. And they said, play along with these. And I'm going, what key are they in? Don't worry about it. Just play along. What I didn't realize they were doing, they were playing me bits and pieces from Diamond Dogs that they were in the process of mixing. So I did that for maybe a half hour. And then David came in the main room, and we sat around with a couple of guitars and bullshitted for maybe an hour. That was my audition.
At the time, did you think, well, this is just going to be for the stage? Or did you know that this was going to be a long-lasting gig?
As far as my view of it at the time, which was naive, because I was only 21 or something, so I hadn't really been around the block much. I thought it was like, now I'm in David Bowie's band, not realizing that's not the reality of sideman business at all.
Can't be an easy gig with him. I heard you in an interview saying that you can't just work for somebody without having some kind of personal connection. You worded it like there can't be a wall up. I mean, to me, Bowie seems like he had a huge wall. But there had to be a different dynamic between you and him and him and the band. Can you talk about that duality of the real Bowie versus the image Bowie versus the musician?
If you look at videos of him, interview videos and stuff, starting in the 90s, like the late 90s, you're going to see more of really what he was like, especially as it got into the 2000s. Right. He was a lot more personable, funny, that wall. Anybody that does this for a living at a level up there, you need the wall. You got to have one, right? Because people will just tread, and you got to be careful. So having said that, though, between me and him, there wasn't a wall, but I was always really cautious about not considering him like my best buddy. I thought, we worked together. I worked for him, even though we worked together. And we had a great relationship, a good personal relationship, as well as we had a great working relationship. But it wasn't like offshore that we'd be calling each other, going out for coffee once a week. You know, right. With that distance, I think that distance is what made us work better together.
He's the boss, you're the workman.
Yeah, but
not in a bad way. Not in
a bad way. He never stated it. He never acted like it. But when somebody is as talented and knows what they're doing the way he did, they command respect naturally. They don't ask for it. They don't push for it. And they don't demand it. It's commanded, not demanded. Two different things. And he earned every bit of that respect. So it really did help putting together whether we were recording or, putting together a tour. It made it a lot easier because I never took anything personally, ever. In general, I don't do that. But with him, I never did.
Yeah. Could he be tough?
Yeah, he could be tough. He was a no-nonsense guy. But the only time you saw that is if he had a really good reason.
And I know it's a cliche, but he constantly reinvented himself. Was that hard on you as a musician, or did you kind of welcome that?
At the beginning, it drove me fucking crazy. It really did, because I'm going, okay, what kind of band are we this week,
Yeah.
But in time, especially after all the years that we hadn't seen each other and we started working together. Was it 99 or 2000, whatever it was. The first thing we did was we started putting together a tour material. And after not being involved such a long time, it all fell into place of it, and it made sense. And, to do a 2.5 hour show of such eclectic material, it's not easy to pull off. And somehow we did it.
Was that Glastonbury? Was that part of that period, or did that come later?
Yeah, no, that was part of that period because in 2000, we didn't per se do a world tour, but we did festivals and TV, and we did specific cities. We did some gigs. And the following year is when we started touring heavy again, 2002, all the way through 2004.
And that's the one where he said he was going to do his hits, so to speak, and then never do them again.
Yeah, that he used to say every time, that one.
Yeah, exactly. Of all the stuff you did with Bowie, what's the one that makes you the most personally proud? Like when you hear it and you go, yeah, I nailed that.
Without a doubt, Station to Station. Just the way it all fell together, because David wanted more of a hybrid between the R&B and the edgier end, the weird stuff and some of the rock and roll stuff, which it gave me more room to be creative. And it was just one of them weird albums, because he had no concept when he came in. Like when Young Americans, he said, we're making a Philly soul album. So it was obvious what was going on.
Right.
With Station, it wasn't, because we went in and not all the material was even finished. We were putting bits and pieces together in the studio. So the atmosphere was more creative that way. And it was insane. It was probably, without a doubt, the most insane record I've ever been involved with, just from people's habits, including my own.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Does cocaine ring a bell? I mean, I wouldn't, this is one of, those to give you those disclaimers. Don't try this at home, kids, Yeah. But the outcome of that record, without a doubt, had everything to do with how the coke affected what we were doing. Because we were young enough at the time to be able to beat ourselves up like that and still get to the studio and still make a really great record. But, the drugs definitely changed what we were doing.
Sure.
I'm not saying that drugs make things better, because sometimes it backfires. In this case, it didn't backfire at all. Our work ethic was together.
Did you know that Bowie was sick?
No, I didn't know.
Wow.
I mean, I knew that he had a heart problem, but we knew that in 2004. But the last time I saw him was when we were finishing up the recording of The Next Day, which was 10 years ago. And he didn't look as well as usual, but he didn't look sick.
Yeah.
So I just thought, you know what? The guy's been in here making this record for like a year and a half. He's got to be spent by now. So that's all I thought of.
Right,
but, he could have been sick then. I have no idea. And I had no idea he was sick until I found out he was gone.
See, I thought I was the only one, because, I was shocked. I felt like I missed something, I was sick. And here you are, you know him, you worked with him. Through the grapevine, nothing came out?
We had no clue. No. I mean, I knew that man very well, and I know the last thing he would have wanted was that to become public.
That last album came out, I think it was pretty much that week.
2 days before he died was that album came out.
That's it.
And then the Black Star album, which was done with a whole different band. I'm not sure if that was released a little bit later.
And what about Toy? Where does that fit in?
Toy is a collection of songs, mostly written at the beginning of David's career.
Right.
Some of them were on albums before. Some of them never really saw the light of day. And he just wanted to take the old material and just sort of readdress it and see what we could do with it. So we went in the studio and re-recorded, I don't know how many of them, basically with the band that we had at the time. It's funny, taking songs that were written in the late 60s, maybe early 70s, that you could still make work with a different band. That's a good song. That's a good songwriter.
Sure. All right, I want to switch gears a little bit, because I know you must be so tired of telling this story, but please tell me about day one working for John Lennon.
Day one with John. The first day, I'd already been working with David, and, I'd been around the block a few times, and I never used to get nervous, and I really still don't. But that I did for that one. And I got to the studio early. I said, I'm going to get there. I think the studio call was for noon. I got there like at 10:30 in the morning. I think I get here before everybody else and I could just sort of chill out.
The Hit Factory, right?
Yeah, the Hit Factory. And when I got there, it was empty until I walked into the main studio and John was in there, which, you know, obviously I was happy to see, but that's not the first person I wanted to see because I thought, what if I just make get embarrassed or make an asshole out of myself? And anyway, it turned out on that first meeting that he says to me, after I introduced myself and he looked at me with a funny look and says, you know, like we knew each other already. Because he's, you know, he co-wrote Fame,
right,
played some guitar on Fame, and we also covered Across the Universe. Both songs are on Young Americans.
Right.
And I completely had no memory of being in the studio with him, but he did. So that was my first meeting with John Lennon, which he thought was quite funny.
Years and years ago, I was lucky enough to interview 𝗵𝘃𝗃, and she's just a sweetheart, great person. And she had mentioned that Fame and Across the Universe were done after Young Americans had been finished. So, you know, maybe in his mind, he thought because you were on the record, does that make sense?
No, they were done at Record Plant. Yeah.
But wasn't that after most of the album had already been recorded?
Yeah, but that album wasn't recorded all in one go anyway. We did that album in bits and pieces. Some of that was recorded while we were on the road. We'd stop in Philly and take 2 days off or 3 days off and record and go back on the road. That's how we made that record, a lot of it. So who knows why?
Yeah.
I mean, I just thought it was quite funny that, you know, of all the people and all the bands, especially because back in the day, everybody had their special Beatle. Oh, are you a Paul guy or a Ringo guy or a John guy or a George guy? I was a John guy. So he was already my favorite Beatle. So in hindsight, it's pretty hysterical. At the beginning, it was embarrassing. I'm going, Jesus, one of my idols here, and I don't remember even working with this guy. This is bad.
To me, he strikes me as the opposite of Bowie in the sense that talking about Bowie had his walls up in interviews in the 70s, and John seems very personable, easy to work with.
Oh no, it was easy. It was so easy. It was akin to being in a functional band. And I don't know too many bands I've been in that have been functional, but it was very functional and easy to work with John. One thing he did do that David started doing later in life was constantly cracking jokes all day. Mm. And his sense of humor was so dark and cutting. I loved it. I thought it was hysterical.
And you can hear a lot of that on bootlegs. And it's great. It does. It seems like a very, lack of a better term, fun atmosphere.
It was.
Guy that big can let loose and be cool and yet get the work done that needs to get done in a relatively quick way, too. It didn't seem like you were belaboring a lot of the stuff.
No, I mean, we did it the way the Beatles did it to a point where John liked to do a lot of takes of stuff. David was the opposite. As soon as we got through one of them that didn't have any mistakes, that was it. But it usually was the run because it was all about the feel. Same thing with John. As soon as it felt right, that was the take. But it didn't feel like work.
And you had 3 guitarists, including him. You had Hugh McCracken. Hugh had been around for quite a while. He was on Paul's Ram album. And he'd worked with John before.
Yeah.
How'd you guys work that out with the 3 guitarists with very different approaches?
Well, the idea when they brought me in was that other than myself, everybody else in that room were all the best of the best session players around. And I wasn't. I was a band guy. I was still playing around in band. And John wanted one guy in there like himself who couldn't really properly read a chord chart. You know, something that would add a little bit more spontaneity. But he still needed that really great band behind him that could read the charts properly and do all that. Right. And I was the one that offset that.
On one of the boots, there's a funny moment where you mention a hammer-on, and you know he never heard that before.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, like, oh yeah, when I did the hammer, he said, what? What is it?
God, if I did a hammer-on, it's got to be one of maybe 2 or 3 that I've done in my entire life. I don't do them.
And then afterwards, he teases you, hey, hammer-on. Come over here.
That's funny.
Yeah.
I don't remember it, but I don't doubt it happened.
I got to send that to you. Oh, yeah. It's great. It was smart of Jack Douglas. I assume Jack Douglas is the one who gave you the call to come to the sessions, right? Yep. It was smart not to just have the same old guys. And nothing against Billy Preston and Klaus and all that. But someone like you with a young approach, that's another thing. You were young. I mean, I don't want to say did you get it? You're not an idiot. But I mean, did you relate to the material?
Oh, yeah. Totally related to it because basically they were traditionally written pop songs. even though some of them were dark. Yeah, I mean, the form of the music he was doing was very familiar to me.
Well, I meant lyrically. I mean, he's talking about family and children and homes and marriages. And what are you, maybe early 30s?
The way that he worded it at the time, I didn't really think of it like that. And to be honest, I think lyrically, I didn't dig into that record until we had finished it. There was too much else going on to pay attention to that.
What kind of gear were you using in those sessions? I mean, did you have any effects, or was it just a matter of if you wanted distortion, you turn the amp up and let the tubes do it? Or...
You know what? I still do that. I was using a Marshall. I think there was a Fender there I might have used. I used a 100-watt Marshall and my 65 SG Junior and a Les Paul, as those are the main guitars on that one.
What was that crazy guitar he was playing?
Oh, Sardonyx. I had one.
Very strange looking.
Very.
Yeah. He had recommended some of the studio tricks that the Beatles utilized, and there was one that interested me, recording the guitar solo for Cleanup Time, was it?
No, it was the one for Losing You. That one, and there's another one. I Don't Want to Face It, which came out on Milk and Honey.
Right.
They take two little Fender amps, little tiny champ amps, little 5-watt, 10-watt amps, and stick a stereo microphone in the middle of them. And both guitar players would basically play the same part at the same time. And it created something. It did, because that solo that's on I Don't Want to Face It, that's actually me and John playing that together with that process.
Is that the thing with the 16th notes?
Yes.
Yeah. It compressed the hell out of it.
Yeah.
Interesting. I know there were some early sessions with Tony Levin and George Small, as well as Tom Peterson, Bunny Carlos, and Rick Nielsen from Cheap Trick. Was that before? Or?
That was before, because Jack brought them in thinking, and rightfully so, that a good younger band to do the record that obviously understood the Beatles would be the right fit. But, they couldn't help but sound like Cheap Trick.
From what I understand, they broke the cardinal rule of not talking about the sessions.
No, that wouldn't have caused a problem. I mean, just from being around the situation, I mean, my thoughts on it are that, it was very distinctively, you could hear it. You could hear Cheap Trick in there, you know?
Yeah.
And that's probably why he brought the session guys in, like Huey McCracken and those guys, and Tony and Andy, because the songs were so diverse that I think he really did need those session guys in there.
What about the memories of the infamous and fabled video shoot that never saw the light of day?
I think that what I'd heard many years ago is most likely what happened. I wouldn't say 100%, but John apparently didn't like the way he looked in those videos, and he got a hold of the tapes and destroyed them. That's the story that I've got. And considering that not 1 second of that film has been seen.
Oh, I hate to contradict you.
Well, I know what you've seen, and that's not what was set up. We had a full-blown video camera shoot in the studio. It wasn't somebody with a little baby camera or something. It was the real deal. So what you've seen, that could have been somebody copied a couple of bits of something.
Yeah.
But you got to understand something. We were filming for 2 days straight.
Okay.
There's at least 16 plus hours of tape.
Oh, I wish that would come out. Because I've heard the audio from it. There was Jack had, I guess, microphones going.
Well, yeah, you would have heard the audio from it, because the whole time we recorded that record, there was a 2-track going that was recording everything in the control room as well as the studio. That's where all of this great stuff that we have now, all these years later, those little blurbs and outtakes and weird shit, because Jack did that. It was a great idea that he did that.
Oh, God, yeah. Just historic.
Yeah.
So that little clip of John doing I'm Losing You, you don't think that that's from the actual...
If anything, maybe somebody had time to copy a little bit of it, but
okay.
Trust me, if there was anything more than that, come on, it's been 42 years. You don't think it would be released? I mean, come on.
It's true. I don't know if it was his BBC interview or the very last one he did, but he was so happy with the band and the way things turned out that he wanted to take it on the road. How far did those plans go? Was it just talk?
Oh, no, they were already on it. I've got a poster here of a gig from 1981 that never happened.
Wow. Love to see that.
It's something that I've not let loose anywhere, but it's a copy of You know, I got it. This is so weird. I've got it hidden in this computer somewhere in my photos folder, and I probably named it something ridiculous so that anybody, I don't want anybody to find it, because it is a poster for, God, it was a gig in London. Weird. Yeah, but yeah, so, they got that far. They were talking to promoters. They were setting things up. It was all in motion.
You've blown my mind.
It was in motion. It was happening because I had to work out a deal with Columbia Records, who I was signed to at the time, because I owed them a record. And we had to postpone the record so I could do the thing with John. So we've gotten that far from my end.
That's incredible. Was it going to be a tour of stadiums, or was it going to be more of arenas?
No, they were going to be, it wasn't going to be stadiums like, Dodger Stadium size. No.
Right.
More like Royal Albert Hall, maybe that kind of thing, or the Garden.
Had any set list been talked about besides the stuff from 𝗵𝘃𝗶𝗵𝘁 and Milk and Honey?
No, we hadn't gotten that far into the conversations. The main thing that was spoken about was, finding out who in the band was available to do it. Because the plan is that in early 81, in January, after the holidays, we were going to go back in and record a few more songs and finish the stuff that became Milk and Honey. Obviously, neither one of those things happened.
Right.
And then after that, we'd be out on tour, and that album would be released sometime in 81 while it was still out. That's what I was told.
How did you hear the news that he'd been killed?
Same way everybody else did, man. TV.
Yeah.
It was a very weird time, even to this day, I don't really think about it much, but once in a while it'll come up and I'll think, wow, man, but now it's so far in the past that it doesn't even seem real anymore in a way.
You're removed from it.
You know what I mean? I am. Yeah. I mean, as well as I knew John and worked with him and did all that stuff, and the assassination, all of it seems like a weird dream.
Yeah, I bet. And I remember being amazed at the time that Yoko poured herself back into working on her first solo album in a while at that point, Season of Glass. You were on that, correct?
Yeah.
Was it the same musicians?
Everything was the same, except Jack Douglas couldn't do it, so they brought Phil Spector in. And we were all excited about that until we started working with him, and it turned out to be the worst nightmare from hell. Yoko wasn't stupid. She picked up on it. I think by week 2, she got rid of him. And then it was just us. It was just the original band, Yoko, and the original engineer from Double Fantasy. Same studio, everything.
Did I hear he was walking around with a gun?
Yeah. Jeez. Yeah. Phil Spector's walked around the studio with one of them Dirty Harry shoulder holster things, It's like, are you fucking kidding me? And he had this bodyguard guy that if he had to go from the control room to the John, he had to walk through this little lounge area, and the bodyguard would come and clear us all out of the room so Phil could walk from the control room to the John.
Please.
And it was the weirdest thing in the world. The control room was blacked out the whole time. I don't know how anybody could even work in there. And when he'd go on the intercom to talk to anybody about something, he would do it through the engineer. He would tell, it was Lee DiCarlo, he'd go, Lee, tell the guitar player on the left to play a G, or tell the drummer to hit his bass drum. Never spoke to us. Everything was through. It was like, are you kidding me? By the time, after the first week I'd had it, and by 2 weeks I was like, oh, I was so happy he just disappeared.
So who produced that, Yoko?
It produced itself. We all did it,
Yeah. So after that, you're back with Bowie. Stevie Ray Vaughan had done the sessions for Let's Dance.
Right.
Were you close to him at all? Did you know him?
Never met him.
Never met him. And for some reason, he couldn't do the tour.
Stevie's relationship with David was basically, he wanted to add that blues element to that record. And I guess somehow he found Stevie. That was the extent of the relationship, because by the time it came to the touring, I think that they couldn't come to proper agreements to get Stevie out. And for whatever reason, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And I got called.
That was a huge tour, the Serious Moonlight tour.
That was a huge tour.
Now, around 85, Brian Setzer splits with the Stray Cats, and suddenly you got Slim Jim Phantom and Lee Rocker find themselves in need of a band and a guitarist, I guess. Is that how Phantom Rocker and Slick came along?
Slim Jim and Lee both, they had a band with a guitar player from Chicago. And they weren't sure if it was the right guy. Anyway, long story short, we'd run into each other at an event in L.A. and started talking. And they said, are you free? I said, yeah, I'm around. So we arranged a rehearsal place and we played together for a few days and decided to give it a go. It fell together very organically.
And it worked. I mean, it was great. I mean, suddenly now here you are on MTV, Men Without Shame's on heavy rotation. You went from sideman to one of the main men. How was that as a transition for you?
It was easy because a lot of the touring I did with David all the way to the end, I had a lot of freedom on stage. So I was used to it. I consider myself at what I do best is as a sideman. I think that's what I do best. Not necessarily a session studio guy, but an all-around, especially touring, which is what I love to do. So I think the fact that I love to do it so much and David gave me room to do it, when Phantom Rocker and Slick came along, it was something I was already doing with David to a degree.
I want to ask you about working with Keith Richards. I mean, that must have been phenomenal. How did that come about?
It came about, actually, Phantom Rocker and Slick record was being mixed at the Media Sound in New York. And Steve Thompson, the producer, was in there mixing. And they had just done Dancing in the Streets with the Bowie and Jagger version.
Yep.
And Jagger wanted some other guitars on there. And Steve called me and says, he wants you to do this. So I was in LA and I flew to New York. I did the session. And it was Mick's birthday. So I got invited to his party at the Palladium. And I ran into Keith. And we got to talking and said we were mixing the record, but we'd love him to play on it. And he said yes. And he showed up. I know what he's like because I've met the guy plenty of times. But you know what? The day they did that, he was supposed to come in like on a Monday. He came a week later, at which point I had a commitment out of town that I couldn't not make. Like one of my best friends I grew up with was wedding. I was the best man, and I was in the Bahamas or something like that.
Sucks. You've played with some of the best, man. It says a lot about you more than anything else.
Well, thank you. I mean, I love what I do, and if it's with the right person, it makes all the difference in the world.
But you walked away from the business, right?
I did.
Sold timeshares or something? Mm-hmm. Felt burnt out? Or?
Yeah. I just hit a point. It was that weird going from rock and roll to the hair band period was still kind of going on. And every project I put together, it just wasn't falling together properly, and I was frustrated and I was starting to get resentful of the business. And I said, you know what? I told myself a long time ago that if this became this, I was at it. I was gone. And I left for 4 years.
And then what got you back in?
About a year before that, or even later than that, I used to live near David Coverdale. And we got together. We were writing songs for like almost a year. And we went and made a record. We didn't tour the record, but that kind of gave me a bit of a taste for it. And I think about 6 months after we finished that record is when David contacted me. It's the end of 99.
And you never looked back?
Nope.
You got a great new record, Fistful of Devils. Instrumentals, fantastic. I listened to it twice this morning. 2 tracks on there that seem to be Lennon inspired, JWL and Dr. Winston O'Boogie. But JWL, what a dark Lennon-esque kind of sound.
That was co-written by Mark Hudson, so that should explain that if you know who Mark is.
Great record. How's it doing?
It's doing all right, I mean, obviously the record wasn't made for a paycheck, that's for sure.
Right.
It was something that I just wanted to do. I still got another one in the can that I haven't released yet. The next thing is going to be spring of next year. I mean, there could be stuff popping up between now and then. I'm sure there will be. But I want to get back touring the UK again because I had to cancel last year because of Lyme disease of all things. And if you live in the Northeast, you know what that is.
Of course.
And it doesn't go away very easy. So I had to bugger out of that last tour last year. So we rescheduled everything for this coming May.
All right. We'll keep an eye on it. Earl, it was an honor to talk to you.
Well, thanks a lot, man. Good questions, my friend.
See, look, hold it. You can have all those holes, Slick. They're all yours. But listen to what I'm saying. 1, 2.
From 1980, that's John Lennon with I'm Losing You, featuring Earl Slick on guitar. And I want to give a huge thank you to Mr. Slick. Mr. Slick, what a strange, for spending time with us on the It's Only Rock and Roll podcast. And check out his latest album, Fistful of Devils. Links are in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to where you can find the It's Only Rock and Roll podcast, whether on our website at www.itsonlyrockandrollpodcast.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube at It's Only Rock and Roll Podcast. All typed out as one word, no abbreviations, spaces, or commas, please. And if you refuse to abide by this simple request, I swear I'll change the show to an all polka hip-hop format, and I ain't bluffing, punk. We have some future guests in the works that will blow your mind, so be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, and I'm going to leave you with a cut off of Earl Slick's new album. This one's called JWL. Thanks for listening to the It's Only Rock and Roll Podcast.